The carriage wheels screeched against the gravel path, as guards dragged Eleanor Ashworth out into the cold morning air. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from disbelief. Just an hour ago, she had been the Duchess of Ashworth, mistress of one of the grandest estates in the country. Now she stood in her nightdress, a wool shawl thrown hastily over her shoulders, while servants who once bowed to her watched from windows with pity or satisfaction. "You will leave for Bramwell before noon," Duke Edward Ashworth said, his voice flat and cold. He did not look at her. He looked instead at the folded letter in his hand, the one that had arrived 3 days earlier, filled with accusations she had never been given the chance to answer. "Edward, please," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her chest. "Whatever you have been told, it is not the truth. Ask me. Let me explain." "There is nothing to explain," he said. 5 years of marriage, and still no heir. And now this letter says you insulted my mother behind her back, that you mocked her health in front of the staff. I have heard enough." Eleanor searched his face for any trace of the man she had married, the man who once wrote her letters filled with warmth and promises. She found nothing there now but a wall, cold and unmoving. Behind him, standing near the doorway with her arms folded and a faint smile tugging at her lips, was Clara Bennet, the young woman the Duke had recently brought into the household as a companion for his ailing mother. Eleanor had always felt something was wrong about Clara, the way she watched, the way she whispered, but she had never imagined the woman capable of orchestrating her downfall. "You believe her," Eleanor said quietly, nodding toward Clara. "You believe a woman you have known for 3 months, over a wife who has stood beside you for 5 years. The Duke's jaw tightened. "This is not about belief. This is about the reputation of this house. You will go to the countryside estate at Bramwell. You will remain there until I decide otherwise." There was no arguing with him. Eleanor understood, in that moment, that the decision had already been made long before she was called into the hall that morning. The letter, whatever lies it contained, had simply been the final piece needed to justify what someone had already planned. As she was led toward the waiting carriage, she caught sight of her lady's maid, Margaret, standing near the servants' entrance. Her eyes wet with tears she dared not show openly. Margaret had served Eleanor since she was a young bride, and in her face, Eleanor saw the only honest grief in the entire courtyard. "Margaret?" Eleanor called softly, and the older woman rushed forward despite the guard's sharp look. "My lady, this is wrong. All of it is wrong," Margaret whispered, gripping Eleanor's hands. "I do not believe a word of what they say." "Thank you," Eleanor said, and for the first time that morning, her composure nearly broke. "Take care of yourself, and if you ever hear anything at all about what truly happened, send word to me." "I will, my lady. I swear it." The guard pulled Margaret back, and Eleanor climbed into the carriage without another glance at the house that had been her home. She refused to give Clara Bennet the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The journey to Bramwell took nearly 2 full days. The carriage rattled over uneven roads, past fields turning gold with the last days of summer, past small villages where children ran barefoot and waved at passing travelers, unaware of the storm raging quietly inside the woman seated behind the curtained window. Eleanor watched the countryside pass by, her mind replaying every moment of the past few months, searching for the exact point where everything had begun to unravel. She remembered the headaches that had plagued her for the better part of a year, headaches that no physician in the capital seemed able to explain. She remembered the strange bitterness in her tea some mornings, a taste she had dismissed as simply poor preparation by a new kitchen maid. She remembered Clara Bennet's sudden arrival, introduced as a distant cousin of the Duke's mother, and how quickly she had made herself indispensable to the household, offering remedies, suggesting changes to Eleanor's diet. Always so helpful, always so quietly present. By the time the carriage reached the gates of Bramwell, the sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows over the neglected estate. The house itself was modest compared to the grandeur Eleanor had known, its stone walls weathered, its gardens overgrown with weeds. An elderly caretaker named Walter greeted her at the door, his expression a mixture of confusion and sympathy. "My lady," he said, bowing awkwardly, "we received word only yesterday that you would be arriving. Forgive the state of things. This house has not seen a proper mistress in many years." "It will do," Eleanor said, stepping inside. The air smelled of dust and old wood, but there was something oddly comforting about the silence of the place, a silence free from whispered accusations and watching eyes. That first night, Eleanor lay awake in a bedroom far smaller than the one she had left behind, staring at the cracked ceiling above her. She could have wept. She could have let the weight of her humiliation crush her entirely. Instead, she found herself thinking of her mother, a woman who had raised 6 children on a modest farm before Eleanor's marriage had lifted the family into a life of comfort. Her mother had always said that a woman's strength was not measured by how well she was treated, but by how she carried herself when treated poorly. "I will not break," Eleanor whispered into the darkness. "Whatever they have done to me, whatever lies they have told, I will not break." The following morning, she rose before dawn, dressed in the simplest gown she had brought with her, and began exploring the estate in the pale early light. The gardens, though overgrown, showed signs of once having been carefully tended. Rows of herbs had gone wild, tangled with weeds, but she recognized several plants her own mother had grown for medicinal purposes back on the farm. Rosemary, lavender, chamomile, and something that looked remarkably like a rare healing herb her mother used for fevers. "Walter," she called, finding the old caretaker mending a fence near the stables. "Who tended these gardens before?" "That would be old Mistress Hartwell, my lady, the previous owner's wife. God rest her soul. She was known throughout the county for her remedies. People used to travel from 3 villages over just to buy her tinctures." Eleanor felt something stir inside her, a small flicker of purpose in the darkness that had settled over her since leaving the capital. Is there anyone still living who remembers her methods? Any records she might have left behind? Walter scratched his weathered chin thoughtfully. "There's an old chest in the cellar, my lady. Belonged to the mistress. Never had the heart to go through it myself." That afternoon, Eleanor descended into the cellar with a lantern in hand, her heart pounding with an anticipation she could not quite explain. The chest, when she found it beneath a pile of old linens, was locked, but the small key hanging from a nail nearby fit perfectly. Inside, she discovered dozens of handwritten journals, filled with detailed notes on herbs, remedies, and treatments for common ailments among the villagers. As she flipped through the pages by lantern light, something else caught her attention, tucked into the back pages of the final journal. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, containing what appeared to be a list of ingredients and dosages for a tonic meant to treat headaches and stomach troubles. But scrawled beside certain ingredients were warnings in a different hand, notes about how, in larger doses over time, these same remedies could cause the very symptoms Eleanor herself had suffered for the past year. Her breath caught. She sat back against the cold stone wall of the cellar, the journal trembling slightly in her hands. Could it be possible? Could someone have been giving her small, careful doses of something meant to weaken her, to create the appearance of illness, perhaps even to explain away the absence of a child that everyone had blamed on her? She thought again of Clara Bennett's suggestions, her teas, her tonics offered so kindly each morning. The pieces began to form a picture too troubling to ignore. That night, Eleanor could not sleep. She lit a candle and copied every relevant page from Mistress Hartwell's journals into a small notebook of her own, determined to understand exactly what had been done to her, and more importantly, to find proof strong enough that no one could dismiss it as mere suspicion. Over the following days, Eleanor threw herself into learning everything the old journals had to teach. She cleared sections of the garden with her own hands, ignoring the ache in her back and the blisters forming on her palms. She spoke with Walter about the local villages, learning which families struggled most, which children fell ill most often, which elderly folks suffered from ailments no traveling physician had ever properly treated. Word of the disgraced Duchess living at Bramwell spread quietly through the countryside, carried by merchants and travelers passing along the main road. Some whispered with scorn, assuming the worst of a woman cast out by her husband. Others, particularly the women of the nearby village of Thornfield, felt a quiet curiosity about her, wondering what kind of person she truly was beneath the scandal attached to her name. It was nearly 2 weeks after her arrival that Eleanor first ventured into Thornfield itself, wearing a plain gray dress and a simple bonnet, carrying a basket of herbs she had gathered and prepared according to Mistress Hartwell's careful notes. She found a young mother outside the village well, cradling a feverish infant, her face lined with worry and exhaustion. "Forgive me for intruding," Eleanor said gently, approaching with careful steps. "I could not help but notice your little one seems unwell. I have some experience with fevers. Might I offer something that could help?" The young mother, whose name Eleanor would later learn was Beatrice, eyed her with suspicion at first, understandably wary of a stranger's remedies. But desperation, and something in the calm confidence of Eleanor's manner, convinced her to accept a small vial of tincture, along with careful instructions for its use. 3 days later, Beatrice appeared at the gates of Bramwell, her infant son now cool to the touch and sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Whatever you gave us, my lady, it worked wonders," she said, tears of gratitude in her eyes. "I do not know how to thank you." "There is no need for thanks," Eleanor replied, though something warm bloomed in her chest at the sight of the healthy child. "I am simply glad he is well." Word of the healing spread quickly after that. Within a month, a small but steady stream of villagers began making their way to Bramwell, seeking remedies for everything from persistent coughs, to troubled joints, to sleeplessness. Eleanor treated each one with patience and care, refusing any payment beyond what families could genuinely afford, sometimes accepting nothing more than fresh eggs or a basket of vegetables in return. Walter, watching this transformation unfold, could hardly believe the change in the woman who had arrived at Bramwell as a broken, disgraced noblewoman. "You have given this old house more life in 2 months than it has seen in 20 years, my lady," he told her one evening as they sat together near the kitchen fire. "This house gave me something too," Eleanor said softly. "It gave me a reason to rise each morning." It was during one of her visits to Thornfield that Eleanor encountered a young boy, no older than 7, sitting alone outside the village chapel, his clothes tattered, his ribs visible beneath a thin, dirty shirt. His name, she would soon learn, was Freddie, and he had no family left to speak of, his mother having died of illness the previous winter, and his father lost to the sea years before that. "Where do you sleep at night, little one?" Eleanor asked, crouching down to meet his wary eyes. "Wherever I can find shelter, miss," Freddie answered, his voice small but steady, carrying a maturity no child his age should have needed to develop. Something in Eleanor's chest ached at the sight of him, a reflection perhaps of her own displacement, her own sense of having been cast aside without cause. Without a second thought, she extended her hand toward him. "Come with me. There is a warm bed and a hot meal waiting at Bramwell, if you would like it." Freddie hesitated only a moment before taking her hand, and from that day forward, the old estate house had not only a garden bursting back to life, but the laughter of a child echoing through its previously silent halls. Meanwhile, far away in the capital, cracks had begun to form in the household Eleanor had left behind. Duke Edward Ashworth found himself troubled by small inconsistencies he had once overlooked. His mother, whose supposed insult had partly justified Eleanor's exile, mentioned one evening that she could not quite recall the conversation Clara had described in such detail months earlier. The Duke dismissed it at first as simply the confusion of old age, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it would not so easily be uprooted. Clara Bennet, for her part, grew more comfortable in her position within the household with each passing month, believing herself secure in the absence of the woman she had so carefully maneuvered out of the picture. She had not counted on the persistence of memory, nor on the quiet loyalty of a lady's maid named Margaret, who watched everything with careful eyes and said very little, waiting patiently for the moment the truth might finally have a chance to surface. Back at Bramwell, as autumn settled over the countryside, and the leaves began to turn shades of amber and gold, Eleanor stood in her flourishing garden with Freddie at her side, teaching him the names of the herbs they had planted together. She did not yet know what the future held, whether she would ever see justice for what had been done to her, or whether she would remain forever in this quiet corner of the countryside. But for the first time since that terrible morning, when she had been dragged from her home in disgrace, Eleanor Ashworth felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. She felt hope. And though she could not have known it then, word of a remarkable healer, living quietly in the countryside, a woman with knowledge far beyond her station, had already begun to travel farther than the villages of Thornfield, carried along trade routes and whispered conversations, drifting slowly, steadily, toward ears that would one day change the entire course of her life. The rain had not stopped for 3 days when Eleanor first noticed the old ledger tucked behind a loose stone in the cellar wall. She had gone down to fetch more dried lavender for a tincture, her boots splashing through a thin puddle that had crept in through a gap beneath the cellar door, when her fingers brushed against something that should not have been there. The stone shifted slightly under her touch, and behind it sat a small leather-bound book, its pages swollen with age and damp. She carried it upstairs immediately, her curiosity outweighing her exhaustion, and sat by the fire with Freddie curled up beside her, already half asleep after a long day helping her sort herbs in the drying shed. The ledger, she soon realized, had belonged not to Mistress Hartwell, but to a physician named Dr. Pratt, a man who had once visited Bramwell decades earlier and apparently left in some haste, judging by the state in which his belongings had been abandoned. The pages were filled with medical notes, most of them unremarkable records of treatments given to villagers long since past. But near the final entries, Eleanor found something that made her sit upright, her tiredness forgotten entirely. There, in careful handwriting, was a formula strikingly similar to the one she had discovered weeks earlier. The same combination of herbs that, in prolonged doses, could mimic the symptoms of poor health and infertility, without ever revealing themselves as anything other than natural weakness. Beside the formula, Dr. Pratt had written a chilling note. This method was requested by a household seeking to remove an unwanted wife without scandal, though I refused to provide it, fearing the harm such a thing could cause an innocent woman. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the words again. If a physician decades ago had refused such a request, it meant this method of quiet cruelty was not new. It meant someone, somewhere, had known exactly how to make a healthy woman appear frail and barren, all without raising suspicion. And if such knowledge existed in old records, it was entirely possible that a corrupt physician, somewhere in her own time, had agreed to provide exactly what Dr. Pratt once refused. She thought immediately of Dr. Wren, the physician who had attended to her for the better part of the previous year, the same man who had solemnly informed the Duke that Eleanor's condition showed little hope of ever producing an heir. She had trusted him completely, had swallowed every tonic he prescribed without question, never once suspecting that his care might have been the very poison working against her. "I need proof," Eleanor whispered to herself that night, staring into the dying embers of the fire. "Suspicion alone will convince no one." The following weeks brought a shift in Eleanor's daily routine. Alongside her work in the garden and her growing reputation as a healer among the villagers of Thornfield, she began quietly gathering information. She wrote to a former friend from her childhood, a woman named Charlotte who had married into a family with connections to several physicians in the capital, asking carefully worded questions about Dr. Wren's reputation and practices. Charlotte's reply arrived nearly a month later, delivered by a passing merchant who agreed to carry correspondence between the countryside and the capital for a small fee. The letter confirmed Eleanor's growing suspicions. Dr. Wren, it seemed, had a reputation among certain circles for being remarkably willing to provide whatever diagnosis a wealthy client requested, regardless of the actual state of a patient's health. Several other noble families, Charlotte wrote, had used his services to arrange convenient explanations for marriages they wished to dissolve without public scandal. Eleanor read the letter twice, then folded it carefully, and placed it inside the same chest where she kept Mistress Hartwell's journals and Dr. Pratt's old ledger. Piece by piece, a case was forming, one that would require careful patience to complete, but one that filled her with a quiet, burning determination she had not felt in years. It was during this same period that Bramwell received an unexpected visitor. Eleanor had been in the garden, teaching Freddie how to properly dry chamomile flowers without crushing their delicate petals, when Walter came hurrying across the lawn, his weathered face flushed with unusual excitement. "My lady, there is a gentleman at the gate. Says he is taken ill on the road and requires assistance. Claims he was traveling to the coast on urgent business." Eleanor wiped the soil from her hands and followed Walter toward the front of the house, where a tall man in traveling clothes leaned heavily against his horse, his face pale and beaded with sweat, despite the cool autumn air. His clothing, though travel-worn, was of fine quality, suggesting he was a man of some means, though he carried none of the obvious markers of nobility that might have announced his status. "Bring him inside," Eleanor instructed immediately, her healer's instincts overriding any caution she might otherwise have felt toward an unknown stranger, "and fetch water and clean linens." The man, who introduced himself simply as Nathaniel, was suffering from a fever that had clearly been building for several days, likely worsened by the exertion of continued travel. Eleanor examined him carefully, noting the particular pallor of his skin, the slight yellow tint at the edges of his eyes, and concluded that he was suffering from a common but potentially serious ailment, often caused by contaminated water along the road. "You should not have continued traveling in this condition," Eleanor said, preparing a tincture from her carefully tended supplies. Another day and this fever might have worsened considerably. My business could not wait, Nathaniel replied weakly, though a faint smile touched his lips at her stern tone. You speak with the confidence of someone who has treated many such cases before. I have learned from necessity, Eleanor said simply, offering him the tincture, along with a cup of warm broth Walter's wife had prepared in the kitchen. Rest now. Speak of business later, when your strength has returned. Nathaniel remained at Bramwell for nearly a week, recovering slowly under Eleanor's careful attention. During his convalescence, he proved to be remarkably intelligent and observant, asking thoughtful questions about the estate, the surrounding villages, and the state of the local roads and trade routes. Eleanor found herself enjoying his company more than she had expected, drawn to his quiet wit and the genuine curiosity with which he approached every subject. What she did not know, and what Nathaniel carefully avoided revealing, was that he served as an undercover investigator for the Crown, traveling through the countryside to assess conditions in regions where local officials had been suspected of corruption and neglect. His journey to the coast had been part of a broader mission to understand why certain provinces had fallen into poverty, despite reports of prosperity sent to the capital. During his recovery, Nathaniel witnessed firsthand the quiet transformation Eleanor had brought to the region. He watched villagers arrive at Bramwell's gates, with ailments both physical and otherwise, and observed the genuine care with which Eleanor treated each one, regardless of their ability to pay. He noted the thriving garden, cultivated from what had clearly once been neglected land, and the small but steady improvement in the well-being of the surrounding villages since her arrival. You have done remarkable work here, Nathaniel remarked one evening, as they sat together near the fire, Freddie already asleep in a chair nearby, exhausted from a day spent helping in the garden. I have traveled through many provinces in recent months, and few have shown such improvement in so short a time. I did what I could, with what I had, Eleanor said modestly, though a small flush of pride colored her cheeks at his words. The people here needed help, and I found purpose in providing it. May I ask, Nathaniel said carefully, how a woman of your evident education and skill came to settle in such a remote corner of the countryside? Eleanor hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal to a man whose full identity she did not yet know. Circumstances beyond my control, she said finally. A misunderstanding that cost me dearly, though I have chosen to build something meaningful from what remained. Nathaniel did not press further, sensing the pain still lingering beneath her carefully composed words. But he made careful mental notes of everything he had witnessed, understanding instinctively that the woman before him was no ordinary countryside healer, but someone of considerable education and refinement, someone whose story likely held far more depth than she had chosen to share. Before departing Bramwell, fully recovered and eager to continue his journey, Nathaniel expressed his gratitude with characteristic sincerity. I owe you my life, quite possibly, he said, mounting his horse in the early morning light. Should you ever find yourself in need of assistance, know that you have made a friend today who will not forget this kindness. Safe travels, Nathaniel, Eleanor replied, watching as he rode toward the horizon, uncertain whether their paths would ever cross again, unaware of just how significant that uncertainty would prove to be. As winter began to settle over Bramwell, bringing with it frost-covered mornings and the need for careful preparation of stores to last through the colder months, Eleanor found herself increasingly absorbed in expanding her knowledge. She corresponded regularly with Charlotte, gathering more information about Dr. Wren and the practices of physicians in the capital. She continued treating villagers from Thornfield and the surrounding areas, her reputation growing steadily, despite her efforts to remain modest about her abilities. Freddie, meanwhile, had settled fully into life at Bramwell, his once gaunt frame filling out with regular meals, his shy demeanor gradually giving way to genuine laughter and curiosity. He followed Eleanor everywhere, eager to learn everything she could teach him about the plants they grew and the remedies they prepared, showing a natural aptitude that reminded Eleanor of her own childhood learning at her mother's side. One particularly cold evening, as snow began to fall softly outside the windows of Bramwell, Walter approached Eleanor with a letter that had arrived earlier that day, carried by a traveling merchant from the capital. Eleanor's heart quickened as she recognized Margaret's handwriting on the envelope, the first word she had received from her former lady's maid since leaving the capital nearly 6 months earlier. She opened the letter with trembling hands, reading Margaret's carefully worded account of the changes taking place within the Ashworth household. The Duke, it seemed, had begun to question the circumstances surrounding Eleanor's exile, troubled by inconsistencies in his mother's memory of the supposed insult that had partly justified his decision. Clara Bennet, meanwhile, had grown increasingly bold in her position, no longer bothering to hide certain behaviors that had once been carefully concealed. Eleanor read the letter twice, then folded it carefully, and placed it alongside the growing collection of evidence she had gathered in the small chest beneath her bed. The pieces were slowly coming together, forming a picture that would one day demand to be seen. But patience, she reminded herself, was a virtue she had learned to cultivate during her months at Bramwell, alongside the herbs and remedies that had become her purpose. As the first snow of winter blanketed the countryside in white, Eleanor Ashworth stood at the window of her modest bedroom, watching the flakes drift down over the garden she had brought back to life, over the estate that had become, against all expectation, a place of genuine healing and quiet strength. She did not know when the moment for justice would finally arrive, but she felt it approaching, slowly and steadily, like the changing of the seasons themselves. Spring arrived at Bramwell with a burst of color that seemed almost defiant against the memory of the long winter that had come before it. The garden Eleanor had nursed back to health through the cold months now exploded with new growth, rows of herbs and flowers stretching toward the sun, with an eagerness that mirrored something growing inside Eleanor herself, a sense of purpose she had never known during her years in the capital. Freddie had grown taller over the winter, his once thin frame now sturdy from regular meals and the physical work of tending the garden alongside Eleanor. He had also grown bolder, asking questions constantly, eager to understand not just how to grow the plants, but why certain remedies worked the way they did. "Why does the lavender help people sleep, but the rosemary keeps them awake and alert?" he asked one bright morning, kneeling beside Eleanor as she showed him how to properly harvest young mint leaves without damaging the plant's roots. "That is a wonderful question," Eleanor said, smiling at his curiosity. "Different plants carry different properties within them, gifts given by nature itself. Part of being a good healer is learning to listen to what each plant can teach us, and matching that gift to what a person truly needs." It was during these quiet months that Eleanor's reputation began to spread beyond the boundaries of Thornfield and the immediately surrounding villages. Merchants traveling the main road told stories of a remarkable healer living at the old Bramwell estate, a woman whose remedies had cured ailments that traveling physicians had declared hopeless. Some stories grew exaggerated in the telling, as such stories often do, but the core of truth within them remained undeniable. Eleanor Ashworth had built something remarkable from the ashes of her disgrace. One particular case brought unexpected attention to her growing reputation. A wealthy merchant named Harold Fenwick, traveling through the region on his way to the coast, arrived at Bramwell's gates with his young daughter, a girl of perhaps 10 years who had been suffering from a persistent cough that no physician in 3 counties had been able to properly treat. The girl, named Charlotte though everyone called her Lottie, had grown weak and pale, her once bright spirit dimmed by months of illness. "I have heard of your work here," Fenwick said, his voice tight with the particular desperation of a father watching his child suffer. "I have spent considerable sums on physicians in the capital, all without success. I beg you, if there is anything you can do." Eleanor examined the young girl carefully, listening to her breathing, checking the color of her skin and the condition of her tongue, asking careful questions about when the cough had begun and what circumstances seemed to worsen it. Within an hour, she had identified the source of the problem, a persistent dampness in the family's coastal home that had settled into the girl's lungs, worsened by treatments that had focused on symptoms rather than the underlying cause. "Your daughter needs dry air and specific herbs to clear the dampness from her lungs," Eleanor explained, preparing a combination of remedies from her carefully stocked supplies. "This will take patience, several weeks at minimum, but I believe her condition can improve significantly if you follow these instructions carefully." Fenwick and his daughter remained in the nearby village of Thornfield for nearly a month, renting rooms at the local inn, while Eleanor treated Lottie daily. Slowly, gradually, the girl's cough began to ease, her color returning, her energy slowly building, until she was once again running and laughing in the village square, much to her father's overwhelming relief and gratitude. "I cannot thank you enough," Fenwick said before departing, pressing a substantial sum of money into Eleanor's hands despite her initial protests. "You have given me back my daughter's health, and I will not forget this kindness. If ever you have need of anything within my power to provide, you have only to send word." Eleanor accepted the payment graciously, understanding that pride should not stand in the way of resources that could help fund the continued care of the villagers, who could not afford to pay at all. But more than the money, what struck her was the way Fenwick's story spread as he continued his travels, carrying tales of the remarkable healer at Bramwell to towns and villages far beyond the immediate region. It was through this expanding network of stories that word eventually reached the ears of a royal physician serving within the king's own court, a man named Dr. Aldridge, who had grown increasingly frustrated with the limitations of traditional medical practice within the capital. Intrigued by tales of remedies that succeeded where conventional treatments had failed, Dr. Aldridge made careful inquiries, eventually learning enough details to recognize that the woman being described bore a striking resemblance, in skill if not in circumstance, to techniques he had once studied in old medical texts long since fallen out of common practice. Meanwhile, back at the capital, tensions within the Ashworth household continued to build beneath a surface of forced normalcy. Duke Edward Ashworth found himself increasingly troubled by dreams of his former wife, memories of gentler days before Clara Bennet's arrival had poisoned the atmosphere of his home. He had begun, quietly and without announcing his intentions to anyone, making his own inquiries into the circumstances that had led to Eleanor's exile. He first approached Dr. Wren directly, requesting a full review of Eleanor's previous medical records, ostensibly to satisfy his own curiosity about whether any treatment might have been overlooked. Dr. Wren, sensing danger in the Duke's uncharacteristically probing questions, grew evasive, providing vague answers that only deepened the Duke's suspicions, rather than putting them to rest. "Your Grace, medical matters are complex," Wren said, shifting uncomfortably under the Duke's steady gaze. "The Duchess's condition, as I explained at the time, showed clear signs of—" "I did not ask for a repetition of your previous diagnosis," Edward interrupted, his voice carrying an edge that had not been present during their earlier conversations. "I asked specifically what treatments were administered, and by whose recommendation." The physician's hesitation, brief though it was, did not escape the Duke's notice. Something was being concealed, and Edward found himself determined to understand exactly what that something might be. Around this same time, the Duke's mother, Lady Constance Ashworth, found herself troubled by her own growing doubts. She had never fully trusted Clara Bennet, despite the young woman's careful attentiveness during her illness, but had dismissed her unease as simply the suspicion of an aging woman, unaccustomed to new faces within her household. Now, as she considered more carefully the exact conversation Clara had described to justify Eleanor's dismissal, Lady Constance found herself unable to recall the specific insult she had supposedly suffered. "Edward," she said one evening, catching her son alone in the study, "I have been thinking about the day Clara came to us, with news of Eleanor's disrespect. I cannot, for the life of me, recall the exact words that were spoken. Is that not strange?" "I have wondered the same thing, Mother," Edward admitted, setting aside the papers he had been reviewing. "I have begun to suspect that we acted too hastily, based on information we never properly verified." Lady Constance's face grew pale with the weight of this realization. If Eleanor was innocent, if we sent her away based on a lie, then what have we done to that poor woman? Neither of them had an answer, but the question lingered in the air between them, a quiet acknowledgement that something had gone terribly wrong, and that the truth, whatever it might reveal, needed to be uncovered. Clara Bennet, sensing the shift in atmosphere within the household, grew increasingly anxious as spring progressed into early summer. She had grown comfortable in her position, enjoying privileges and attention she had never known before arriving at Ashworth Manor, but the careful web of lies she had constructed felt increasingly fragile beneath the weight of the Duke's quiet investigation. She began making mistakes born of desperation, small inconsistencies in her stories, that further fed the growing suspicion surrounding her. Back at Bramwell, unaware of these developments unfolding in the capital, Eleanor continued her quiet work, treating villagers, tending her garden, and raising Freddie with a warmth and dedication that had transformed the once neglected estate into something resembling a genuine home. She had received another letter from Margaret that spring, hinting at growing tension within the Ashworth household without providing specific details, careful as always not to put anything too dangerous into writing that might fall into the wrong hands. Eleanor found herself uncertain how to feel about these developments. Part of her, the part that had loved Edward Ashworth once with genuine devotion, felt a flicker of hope that perhaps the truth might finally be recognized. But another part of her, hardened by the months of quiet rebuilding she had undertaken at Bramwell, felt a growing certainty that her future no longer depended on whether her former husband chose to believe her innocence. She had built something meaningful here, something that belonged entirely to her, earned through her own efforts and skill, rather than granted through marriage or noble birth. "Do you think you will ever go back?" Freddie asked one evening, as they sat together, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink over the garden they had built together. Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not know, Freddie, but I have learned something important during our time here. Wherever I go, whatever happens, I carry with me now the knowledge that I can build something worthwhile from even the most difficult circumstances. That is not something anyone can take away from me again." Freddie nodded solemnly, understanding perhaps more than most children his age the deeper meaning behind her words. He had, after all, built his own new life from circumstances far more difficult than most children ever faced, and he recognized, in Eleanor's quiet strength, a reflection of the resilience he had needed to develop himself. As summer approached, bringing with it the promise of a full harvest from the garden they had cultivated together, Eleanor received word that would set in motion events neither she nor anyone at Bramwell could have fully anticipated. A royal messenger, traveling through the region on official business, had heard the increasingly widespread stories of the remarkable healer at Bramwell, and made a note to include this information in his reports back to the capital, unaware that this simple act of documentation would eventually reach ears far more significant than he could have imagined. The letter arrived at Bramwell on a warm afternoon in early summer, carried not by the usual traveling merchant but by an official courier, wearing the unmistakable colors of the royal household. Walter answered the door, and his face went pale, with a mixture of confusion and alarm, as he accepted the sealed envelope, uncertain what business the crown might have with a disgraced duchess living quietly in the countryside. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, her mind racing through every possible reason such a letter might have found its way to her doorstep. Had someone discovered her true identity? Had the Duke finally taken some official action regarding their marriage? The letter, when she finally read its contents, revealed something entirely different from anything she had anticipated. The letter was an official inquiry from the royal court, addressed not to Eleanor Ashworth, but to whoever managed the healing practices being conducted at the Bramwell estate. It explained that reports had reached the king's own physician regarding remarkable treatments being administered in the countryside, treatments that had succeeded in cases where conventional medicine had failed. The letter requested that this healer travel to the capital to demonstrate their methods before a panel of royal physicians, with the possibility of formal recognition and potential appointment to assist in addressing certain ongoing health concerns within the kingdom. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before the full weight of its implications settled over her. This was not an invitation extended to the disgraced Duchess of Ashworth. This was an invitation extended to Eleanor Hartley, the name she had begun using quietly among the villagers who knew nothing of her previous life. A name that carried none of the scandal attached to her marriage, only the growing reputation she had built through her own skill and dedication. "What does it say, my lady?" Walter asked, watching her expression shift through a range of emotions he could not quite identify. "It appears," Eleanor said slowly, still processing the reality of what she held in her hands, "that I have been summoned to the capital, not as the Duchess of Ashworth, but as a healer whose reputation has somehow reached the royal court itself." The decision to accept or decline this invitation was not one Eleanor made lightly. Returning to the capital meant risking recognition, risking the possibility that her true identity might be discovered before she was ready to face the consequences of that revelation. It also meant leaving behind, at least temporarily, the quiet life she had built at Bramwell, the garden she had nursed back to health, the villagers who had come to depend on her care, and Freddie, who had become as dear to her as any child of her own blood might have been. But it also represented an opportunity she could not have imagined possible just a year earlier, a chance to be recognized for her own genuine skill and dedication, entirely separate from her marriage, and the noble title that had brought her nothing but heartbreak. After several days of careful consideration, discussing the matter thoroughly with Walter, and even, in her own way, With Freddie, Eleanor made her decision. "I will go," she told Walter one evening, the letter placed carefully on the table between them. "But I will go as Eleanor Hartley, healer of Bramwell, not as the Duchess of Ashworth. That woman, I fear, no longer exists in any meaningful sense." Preparations for the journey took nearly 2 weeks. Eleanor carefully documented her most successful remedies, preparing samples of her most effective tinctures and salves, along with detailed notes explaining the reasoning behind each treatment. She arranged for a trusted village woman named Agnes, who had been assisting her with the growing number of patients arriving at Bramwell, to continue caring for those who still needed treatment during her absence. Freddie, initially devastated at the thought of being separated from Eleanor, was ultimately reassured by her promise to return, and by the responsibility she entrusted to him in helping Agnes maintain the garden in her absence. "You have learned so much already," Eleanor told him, kneeling to meet his eyes on the morning of her departure. "I trust you to help take care of everything while I am away. Can you do that for me?" "Yes, Eleanor," Freddie said solemnly, using her given name as she had encouraged him to do in private moments, though he still called her my lady, in front of visitors, out of the habit of respect he had developed. "I will take good care of everything, I promise." The journey to the capital took nearly a week, traveling by carriage, provided by the royal courier who had delivered the original invitation. Eleanor spent much of the journey reviewing her notes, mentally preparing herself for the scrutiny she would face from royal physicians who had likely spent decades studying medicine through formal education, while her own knowledge had been gathered through practical experience and old journals discovered in a dusty cellar. As the carriage finally approached the outskirts of the capital, Eleanor felt a complex mixture of emotions wash over her. This was the city she had once called home, the place where she had married with genuine hope for happiness, the place where that happiness had ultimately been shattered by lies and deception. Now she returned not as a duchess, but as something entirely new, a woman whose worth would be judged solely on her own merit, rather than her marriage or noble birth. The residence provided for her stay was modest, compared to the grandeur of Ashworth Manor, a comfortable but simple house near the outskirts of the palace grounds, arranged specifically for visiting specialists summoned to demonstrate their skills before the royal court. Eleanor settled into her temporary lodgings with a strange sense of displacement, aware that she now walked streets she had once traveled as a woman of significant status, unrecognized by anyone who might have known her previous face. The following morning, she was escorted to a private chamber within the palace grounds, where a panel of 3 royal physicians awaited her demonstration. Among them, to her considerable surprise and quiet relief, sat Dr. Aldridge, the very physician whose curiosity had originally prompted the inquiry that brought her to the capital. "Miss Hartley," Dr. Aldridge greeted her, his expression carrying genuine scholarly interest rather than the skepticism she had anticipated from royal physicians accustomed to formal medical training. "We have heard remarkable accounts of your work in the countryside. We are eager to understand your methods." Eleanor presented her case with careful precision, describing the ailments she had treated, the remedies she had developed, and the reasoning behind each treatment, based on the principles she had learned from Mistress Hartwell's old journals combined with her own careful observation and experimentation. The physicians listened with growing interest, occasionally interrupting with pointed questions designed to test the depth of her understanding. "You claim this tincture successfully treated a persistent lung condition in a young girl," one of the physicians said, his tone carrying a note of challenge. "Yet conventional treatments for such conditions have proven largely ineffective throughout medical history. What makes you believe your remedy succeeded where established methods have failed?" "I do not claim my methods replace all conventional treatment," Eleanor replied calmly, having anticipated such challenges during her preparation for the journey. "I simply observed that certain treatments focused on managing symptoms without addressing underlying causes. In the case you mention, the persistent dampness in the family's living situation was contributing to the condition. Treating the environment alongside the symptoms produced results that treating symptoms alone had failed to achieve." The demonstration continued for the better part of the day, with Eleanor presenting case after case, backed by careful notes and honest acknowledgement of both her successes and the limitations of her knowledge. By the time the session concluded, even the most skeptical of the 3 physicians appeared genuinely impressed by the thoughtful, methodical approach she brought to her practice. "Miss Hartley," Dr. Aldridge said as the session drew to a close, Your work demonstrates a remarkable understanding of practical medicine, developed entirely outside formal training. This is precisely the kind of innovative thinking we hope to bring greater attention to within royal medical practice. We would like to arrange a formal presentation before the king himself, along with several other members of the court, who have expressed interest in your remarkable reputation. Eleanor's heart raced at these words, the magnitude of the opportunity before her settling in slowly. To be presented before the king himself, to have her work recognized at the highest level of the kingdom, represented a validation she had never imagined possible during those dark early days at Bramwell, when she had arrived as nothing more than a disgraced, exiled wife. "I would be honored," she said, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions building within her. As she left the palace grounds that evening, walking back toward her temporary lodgings, through streets bathed in the golden light of sunset, Eleanor could not help but reflect on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of humiliation and abandonment, she had built something entirely her own, something that now stood on the verge of recognition at the highest levels of the kingdom. She thought of Freddie, tending the garden back at Bramwell, with Agnes's help, and felt a pang of longing, mixed with pride, at the responsibility she had entrusted to him. She thought of Walter, whose faith in her abilities had never wavered since her arrival at the neglected estate, and despite herself, she thought of Edward, wondering whether news of her presence in the capital might eventually reach his ears, wondering how he might react to learning that the woman he had cast aside in disgrace now stood on the threshold of royal recognition. But these thoughts, she reminded herself firmly, mattered far less than they once might have. Whatever happened next, whether her former husband learned of her success or remained entirely unaware, Eleanor Hartley had built a life and a reputation entirely through her own efforts. That achievement belonged to her alone, unshaken by whatever judgments others might choose to render. That night, unable to sleep, despite her exhaustion from the long day of demonstration and scrutiny, Eleanor sat by the window of her temporary lodgings, watching the lights of the capital flicker in the darkness. Somewhere in that same city, within the walls of Ashworth Manor, Edward Ashworth continued his own quiet investigation into the truth of what had happened to his wife, unaware that the very woman he sought answers about now walked the streets of his city, closer than he could have imagined, yet further from the woman he had once known than either of them fully understood. The great hall of the palace had been prepared for the formal presentation, its high windows allowing streams of afternoon light to fall across polished marble floors, illuminating the gathered assembly of nobles, physicians, and court officials who had come to witness the demonstration of the countryside healer, whose reputation had traveled so far beyond her humble circumstances. Eleanor stood near the entrance, dressed in a simple but elegant gown of deep blue, her hands folded calmly in front of her despite the nervous energy coursing through her body. She had spent the previous days preparing meticulously for this moment, reviewing her notes, organizing her samples, and mentally rehearsing responses to the questions she anticipated from a room full of skeptical nobility. But nothing could have fully prepared her for the sight that greeted her as she entered the hall and caught sight of a familiar figure standing near the front of the assembly, engaged in quiet conversation with several court officials. Nathaniel, the traveler she had nursed back to health during his fever the previous autumn, stood among the gathered dignitaries, dressed now in the fine formal attire of a court official rather than the simple traveling clothes she remembered. Their eyes met across the crowded hall, and she watched surprise flicker across his features, quickly followed by something warmer, a genuine pleasure at recognizing her among the assembly. "Miss Hartley," he said, making his way toward her as she waited to be called forward for her formal presentation. "I had no idea the remarkable healer summoned before the king would prove to be the very woman who nursed me back to health at Bramwell. This is a delightful surprise." "Nathaniel," Eleanor replied, genuine warmth coloring her voice, despite the nervous energy of the moment. "I confess I did not expect to see you here either. I had no idea you held such a position within the court." "I serve as an investigator for the Crown," he explained quietly, traveling through the provinces to assess conditions that reports from local officials often fail to accurately represent. "My illness during our first meeting occurred during just such a journey. I mentioned the remarkable work you had accomplished at Bramwell in my subsequent reports, though I confess I did not realize how quickly word would travel through other channels as well." Before Eleanor could respond further, a court official called her name, signaling that the time for her formal presentation had arrived. She took a steadying breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked forward to stand before the raised platform where King George himself sat, flanked by advisors and observing the proceedings with evident curiosity. The king, a man of perhaps 50 years with a stern but not unkind expression, regarded her with the measured attention of someone accustomed to evaluating the worth of those brought before him. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, "I understand you have developed remarkable healing methods through practical experience rather than formal training. Dr. Aldridge speaks highly of your demonstration before our royal physicians. Please, share with us the nature of your work." Eleanor presented her case with the same careful precision she had demonstrated before the panel of physicians days earlier, describing the challenges faced by rural communities that lacked access to formal medical training, and the practical remedies she had developed through careful study of old herbal knowledge combined with patient observation of what actually helped those suffering from various ailments. She spoke of the young girl with the persistent cough, of villagers suffering from ailments that traveling physicians had declared untreatable, of the gradual restoration of health and vitality throughout the region surrounding Bramwell. As she spoke, she noticed several nobles in the audience exchanging glances of surprise and growing interest, while the king himself leaned forward slightly, evidently intrigued by the practical wisdom evident in her explanations. When she finished her presentation, a moment of silence fell over the hall before the king spoke again. "This is remarkable work indeed, Miss Hartley. Our kingdom currently faces significant challenges in several provinces where agricultural difficulties have led to widespread illness among populations already weakened by poor harvests. Dr. Aldridge has suggested that your practical approach to medicine, combined with your evident understanding of the connection between environmental conditions and health, could prove invaluable in addressing these ongoing concerns." Eleanor's heart raced at these words, hardly daring to believe the direction this conversation seemed to be taking. "I would be honored to offer whatever assistance I can, Your Majesty." "Excellent," the king said, satisfaction evident in his tone. "I am prepared to offer you a formal position, advising on health matters within affected provinces, along with appropriate compensation and resources to expand your work beyond the single estate where you currently practice. This is not a position I offer lightly, Miss Hartley. It carries significant responsibility and will require considerable dedication." "I understand, Your Majesty," Eleanor said, her voice steady, despite the overwhelming nature of the moment. "I have dedicated myself to this work because I believe deeply in its importance. I would consider it the greatest honor to continue this dedication in service to the kingdom." The formal ceremony that followed felt almost dreamlike to Eleanor, as documents were prepared officially recognizing her new position and the resources that would be allocated to support her continued work. She would maintain her base of operations at Bramwell, but with royal support, she could now expand her efforts to reach additional provinces struggling with similar health challenges, training local practitioners in her methods, and establishing a network of care that had previously existed only in the isolated success she had built through her own individual efforts. As the formal proceedings concluded, and the assembly began to disperse into smaller conversations throughout the hall, Eleanor found herself surrounded by curious nobles, eager to learn more about her remarkable story, several of them mentioning relatives or acquaintances who might benefit from her expertise. She answered their questions with practiced grace, though her mind remained partially focused on the reality that she now stood, quite literally, at the heart of the very court from which she had once been so thoroughly cast aside. It was during this period of celebration and congratulation that Eleanor first noticed a familiar face across the crowded hall, a face that made her breath catch, and her carefully maintained composure waver for just a moment. Duke Edward Ashworth stood near the edge of the assembly, evidently having attended the presentation as part of his ongoing duties within the court, his expression frozen in an unmistakable look of shock as his eyes met hers across the distance separating them. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the noise of the surrounding celebration seeming to fade into distant background as they simply stared at each other, the woman he had banished in disgrace now standing at the center of royal recognition, transformed in ways he could scarcely comprehend from the broken figure he had watched depart from his estate nearly a year earlier. Eleanor felt Nathaniel's hand rest gently on her arm, a quiet gesture of support that helped ground her in the present moment. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, noticing the sudden tension in her expression. "I am fine," Eleanor said, though her voice carried a slight tremor she could not quite suppress. I simply was not prepared to encounter someone from my past quite so directly. Before Edward could gather himself enough to approach, several other nobles claimed Eleanor's attention with additional questions about her work, and she found herself grateful for the distraction, however temporary it might prove to be. She knew, with absolute certainty, that this encounter represented only the beginning of a much larger conversation that would need to take place, but she was not yet prepared to face it in the midst of such a public celebration. As the evening progressed and the formal reception began to wind down, Eleanor made her way toward the palace gardens, seeking a few moments of quiet reflection, away from the overwhelming attention she had received throughout the day. The gardens, illuminated by lanterns hung carefully among the trees, offered a peaceful respite from the noise and excitement of the great hall. She had not been walking long among the carefully manicured paths when she heard footsteps approaching from behind, and turned to find Edward standing several paces away, his expression a complex mixture of shame, confusion, and something that might have been genuine relief at seeing her alive, and evidently thriving, despite everything that had happened between them. "Eleanor," he said, her actual name, rather than the alias she had adopted, confirming that he had indeed recognized her fully, despite the changes time and circumstance had wrought. "I hardly know what to say. I did not expect. I never imagined I would see you again, let alone in circumstances such as these." Eleanor regarded him carefully, searching for the anger and betrayal she had expected to feel at this moment, and finding instead a strange sense of calm distance, as though she observed this conversation from somewhere slightly removed from her own emotions. "Neither did I, Edward, though I confess I have thought of this moment many times during the past year, wondering what I might say, if our paths ever crossed again. I have been trying to understand what truly happened," Edward said, his voice carrying genuine distress. "I have begun to suspect that the accusations against you may not have been entirely truthful. My mother cannot even properly recall the conversation that was supposedly the basis for—" "They were not truthful at all," Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady but firm. "I have spent the past year gathering proof of exactly what was done to me, and by whom. But that conversation, Edward, will need to happen at another time. Tonight is not the occasion for such revelations." Edward nodded slowly, understanding perhaps for the first time the full weight of what his hasty judgment had cost this remarkable woman standing before him, a woman who had somehow transformed exile and disgrace into genuine recognition and purpose entirely through her own strength and determination. "Will you allow me the opportunity to make things right?" he asked quietly. "Whatever proof you have gathered, whatever truth needs to be revealed, I want to understand it fully. I want to correct the terrible wrong I have done to you." Eleanor considered his words carefully before responding, aware that whatever answer she gave would shape the course of events that followed. "I will share what I know, Edward, when the proper time comes. But know this, whatever happens between us, I am no longer the woman you sent away in disgrace. I have built a life of my own, earned through my own efforts, and that life will continue, regardless of what conclusions you reach about our shared past." With that, she turned and walked back toward the lights and noise of the great hall, leaving Edward standing alone among the shadowed garden paths, confronting the full weight of consequences he had never anticipated when he signed those hasty papers of exile so many months before. News of Eleanor's new appointment spread quickly through the capital in the days following the formal presentation, carried through the usual channels of court gossip and passed among servants and nobles alike with growing fascination. The story of a countryside healer summoned before the king himself, granted formal recognition and resources to expand her practical medicine throughout struggling provinces, captured the imagination of a court that thrived on tales of unexpected fortune and remarkable transformation. Clara Bennet heard the story from a fellow servant while attending to Lady Constance's morning preparations, and felt an immediate, cold dread settle in her stomach as details of the healer's background began circulating. A woman who had arrived at a neglected countryside estate roughly a year earlier, transforming both the land and the surrounding community through remarkable skill and dedication. The timing aligned too precisely with Eleanor's exile for Clara to dismiss as mere coincidence. "Have you heard the name of this remarkable healer?" Clara asked carefully, attempting to maintain a casual tone despite the anxiety building within her. "Eleanor Hartley, they say," the servant replied cheerfully. unaware of the significance her words carried. Though some whisper she might have connections to nobility, given her evident education and refinement. Quite the mystery, really. Clara excused herself quickly, retreating to her private quarters, where she sat trembling, understanding, with growing certainty, that the woman she had so carefully arranged to have exiled had somehow not only survived her disgrace, but transformed it into something far more significant than Clara could have anticipated. If Eleanor had indeed gained the king's favor, if she now possessed resources and connections extending directly to the royal court itself, the careful web of deception Clara had constructed stood in genuine danger of complete collapse. Meanwhile, Duke Edward Ashworth had thrown himself fully into uncovering the truth of what had happened during those fateful months before Eleanor's exile. Having confirmed his suspicions through their brief conversation in the palace gardens, he now pursued the matter with the full authority his position provided, summoning Dr. Wren for a formal interview that left little room for the physician's previous evasive answers. "I require complete honesty," Edward said, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of ducal authority, as Dr. Wren stood before him, visibly nervous, despite his attempts to maintain composure. "I have learned that my former wife has developed a reputation as a healer of remarkable skill, recognized even by the king's own physicians. This stands in direct contradiction to your diagnosis that her condition showed no hope of improvement, that she suffered from a persistent weakness that would prevent her from ever bearing children." Dr. Wren's face paled considerably at these words, understanding that the foundation of lies he had helped construct now stood exposed to scrutiny from which he could not easily escape. "Your Grace, Were you paid to provide false diagnosis?" Edward interrupted, his patience thoroughly exhausted after months of growing suspicion. "I ask you directly, and I expect a truthful answer, or I will ensure that whatever consequences follow will be considerably more severe than they might otherwise be." Faced with the Duke's evident determination and the weight of evidence beginning to accumulate against him, Dr. Wren's careful composure finally crumbled entirely. He confessed, haltingly at first but with increasing detail, to having been approached by Clara Bennet shortly after her arrival at Ashworth Manor, offered substantial payment to provide medical opinions supporting whatever narrative she wished to establish regarding Eleanor's health and behavior. "She provided me with substances to add to the Duchess's regular tonics," Wren admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Substances that would create the appearance of the symptoms described in my diagnosis, without causing any lasting harm that might be detected through careful examination. I understood it as simply providing a convenient explanation for a household matter, Your Grace. I did not fully consider the harm such deception might cause an innocent woman." Edward felt something cold and furious settle over him as he absorbed the full weight of this confession. Not only had Eleanor been innocent of every accusation leveled against her, but she had been deliberately, systematically poisoned and manipulated by a woman he had welcomed into his household, all while he had been too blind or too trusting to recognize the deception unfolding directly before him. "You will provide a complete written confession detailing everything you have just told me," Edward said, his voice cold with barely controlled anger. "And you will understand that your practice within this capital is now at an end. I will personally ensure that every family who might have relied upon your services is made aware of your willingness to provide false diagnosis for payment." Dr. Wren, understanding the severity of consequences now facing him, agreed immediately, providing a detailed written confession that Edward carefully preserved alongside other evidence he had begun accumulating regarding the true circumstances of Eleanor's exile. Armed with this confession, Edward next turned his attention to Clara Bennet herself, though he approached this confrontation with considerably more caution, aware that a woman capable of such elaborate deception might prove equally capable of denying everything without concrete proof to counter her claims. He arranged for Margaret, Eleanor's former lady's maid whose loyalty had never wavered throughout the entire ordeal, to quietly gather whatever additional information she could regarding Clara's activities and communications during the period surrounding Eleanor's exile. Margaret's careful investigation revealed additional damning evidence, including letters Clara had exchanged with a cousin employed within Dr. Wren's household, letters that referenced payments made for services rendered and celebrated the successful removal of an obstacle to Clara's ambitions within the Ashworth household. Combined with Dr. Wren's confession, this evidence created an overwhelming case against Clara Bennet that would leave little room for denial or escape. Back at the capital, Eleanor had begun the challenging work of establishing her new role, meeting with royal officials to understand the specific health crises affecting various provinces, and developing plans to train local practitioners in her methods. Nathaniel, given his own extensive travels throughout the kingdom's provinces, proved an invaluable resource in this planning, offering detailed knowledge of specific regional challenges that helped Eleanor prioritize where her expanding efforts might prove most beneficial. The southern provinces have suffered particularly from poor harvests these past 2 years, Nathaniel explained during one of their frequent planning sessions, spreading maps across the table between them. Malnutrition has weakened resistance to common illnesses that might otherwise be easily treated. Your knowledge of both healing remedies and agricultural improvement could prove doubly valuable in such regions. I would need to establish proper training programs, Eleanor mused, studying the maps carefully. I cannot personally treat every affected village throughout the kingdom, but if I can teach local practitioners the principles behind effective treatment, rather than simply providing remedies directly, the benefit could extend far beyond what I alone could accomplish. Their working relationship had grown into something resembling genuine friendship over the weeks following Eleanor's formal appointment, built on mutual respect and shared dedication to improving conditions throughout the struggling provinces. Nathaniel found himself increasingly drawn to Eleanor's combination of practical wisdom and genuine compassion, while Eleanor appreciated his straightforward honesty and evident admiration for her accomplishments. Admiration that never carried the possessive quality she had experienced during her marriage to Edward. It was during one such planning session that a messenger arrived bearing word from Edward himself, requesting a formal meeting to discuss matters of considerable importance regarding evidence he had gathered relevant to her previous exile. Eleanor read the message carefully, understanding that the moment she had anticipated since their brief garden conversation had finally arrived. I must attend to this, she told Nathaniel, folding the letter carefully. Whatever else has changed between us, this matter of truth and justice cannot remain unresolved indefinitely. Would you like company for this meeting? Nathaniel offered, genuine concern evident in his expression. I understand if you would prefer to face this alone, but know that you need not do so if you would rather have support present. Eleanor considered his offer with genuine appreciation for the kindness behind it. Thank you, Nathaniel. I believe this particular conversation is one I need to face myself. But I am grateful, more than you likely realize, for your friendship throughout these past months. As she prepared for the upcoming meeting with Edward, gathering her own evidence alongside whatever documentation he had assembled, Eleanor felt a complex mixture of anticipation and calm resolve. The truth, long buried beneath layers of deception and manipulation, finally stood ready to emerge into the light, and with it, the possibility of genuine justice for the wrong that had been done to her. The meeting took place in a private study within Ashworth Manor, a room Eleanor remembered well from the years she had spent as mistress of the household, though she now entered it as a visitor rather than the woman who once called this house home. Edward waited for her arrival, with visible nervousness, papers spread carefully across the desk before him, representing the culmination of months spent uncovering the truth of what had been done to his wife. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting, Edward said, as Eleanor took a seat across from him, her posture composed, despite the weight of emotion undoubtedly stirred by returning to this familiar setting. I have gathered evidence that I believe confirms everything you likely already suspected regarding the circumstances of your exile. Eleanor listened carefully as Edward explained Dr. Wren's confession, the specific substances added to her regular tonics, designed to create false symptoms of poor health, and the payments arranged through Clara Bennett to ensure the physician's cooperation in providing false diagnosis. She had, of course, suspected much of this already through her own investigation at Bramwell, but hearing the confirmation directly, understanding the full deliberate cruelty of what had been done to her, still struck her with considerable emotional force. I have my own evidence to share as well, Eleanor said, once Edward finished his explanation, retrieving from her bag the careful documentation she had gathered over the past year. She showed him Mistress Hartwell's old journals, the formula for symptoms that mimicked infertility and weakness, and Dr. Pratt's ledger from decades earlier, containing the chilling note about a household requesting exactly such deception. This confirms it was not the first time such methods had been requested, Eleanor explained. Someone within your household, likely Clara herself, had knowledge of these old practices, knowledge that allowed her to systematically poison me while maintaining the appearance of natural illness. Edward's expression grew increasingly troubled as he absorbed the full scope of what had been done, understanding with growing horror that his own hasty judgment had made him complicit in a scheme far more calculated and cruel than he had initially imagined. "I do not know how to properly apologize for what I allowed to happen to you, Eleanor. I believed accusations without proper investigation, dismissed your protests of innocence without genuine consideration, and sent you away to what I assumed would be a life of quiet obscurity." "You did," Eleanor said, her voice steady, but carrying an undeniable edge of the pain she had carried throughout the past year. "But I have built something meaningful from what remained after your judgment, Edward. That obscurity you assumed I would face became instead the foundation for a life entirely my own, built through my own efforts and skill." "I understand that now," Edward said quietly, "and I am prepared to see justice properly served, regardless of what personal consequences might follow from exposing the truth. Clara will face appropriate consequences for what she has done, and I intend to formally acknowledge publicly the wrong I committed against you." The formal reckoning that followed took place before a gathering of the same court nobility who had witnessed Eleanor's earlier presentation before the king, though this occasion carried a considerably different atmosphere, heavy with the weight of scandal and revelation rather than celebration. Clara Bennet stood before the assembly, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering as Edward presented the accumulated evidence of her deception, from Dr. Wren's written confession to the incriminating letters Margaret had discovered, detailing payments and celebrations of Eleanor's successful removal. "I acted only to secure my own position," Clara finally admitted, her voice breaking under the weight of exposure she could no longer avoid. "I never intended for such consequences to fall upon Lady Eleanor. I simply wished to establish myself within this household, and her presence stood as an obstacle to that ambition." "You deliberately poisoned an innocent woman," Edward said, his voice carrying cold fury, barely contained by the formal setting of the gathering. "You conspired to have her falsely accused and exiled from her own home, all to advance your own selfish ambitions. There is no justification that could possibly excuse such deliberate cruelty." The consequences that followed for Clara Bennet proved severe. Stripped of her position within noble society, and formally banished from the capital, her reputation thoroughly destroyed by the public revelation of her deception. Dr. Wren faced similar consequences, his medical practice permanently closed, his reputation destroyed among the very nobility who had once relied upon his services. For Eleanor, watching this formal reckoning unfold, the experience brought a complex mixture of vindication and lingering sadness for the year of her life stolen through such deliberate cruelty. She felt genuine satisfaction at seeing justice finally served, at having her innocence formally acknowledged before the very court that had once accepted her disgrace without question. But she also recognized, with quiet clarity, that this justice could not fully restore what had been taken from her, the trust once shared with a husband who had believed lies over her own protests of innocence. "What will you do now?" Edward asked her privately, once the formal proceedings had concluded and the gathered nobility had begun to disperse into quiet conversations about the scandal they had just witnessed. "I would understand if you wished to formally end our marriage, given everything that has happened. But I would also welcome the opportunity to earn back your trust, if you believed such a thing were possible." Eleanor considered his question carefully, understanding that whatever answer she provided would shape the remainder of both their lives. "I have built something meaningful at Bramwell, Edward, something that continues to grow through my new position within the King's service. I cannot simply return to being the Duchess of Ashworth as though the past year never happened. That woman, in many ways, no longer exists." "I do not ask you to become who you once were," Edward said quietly. "I only ask whether there might be room, in whatever life you continue building, for the possibility of reconciliation, however long that process might take." Eleanor did not provide an immediate answer, understanding that such a significant decision deserved careful consideration, rather than a hasty response, born of the emotional weight of the day's revelations. "I will consider it, Edward. But know that whatever decision I ultimately reach, it will be my own choice, made freely, rather than an obligation imposed by our previous marriage or your current remorse." As she left Ashworth Manor that evening, walking through streets bathed in the fading light of sunset, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment of formal vindication. The disgraced Duchess, exiled in shame, had become Eleanor Hartley, healer and royal advisor, recognized for her own genuine merit rather than any noble title or marriage. Whatever choice she ultimately made regarding her relationship with Edward, that transformation remained entirely her own, earned through resilience and dedication that no amount of scandal or deception could ever fully undo. In the weeks following Clara Bennet's public disgrace, Eleanor found herself increasingly occupied with the demands of her new position, traveling between the capital and Bramwell as she worked to establish training programs for local practitioners throughout the struggling provinces Nathaniel had identified as most in need of assistance. The work proved exhausting but deeply satisfying, allowing her to witness firsthand the gradual improvement in health and vitality among communities that had previously suffered from limited access to effective medical care. Freddie, meanwhile, had grown considerably during Eleanor's periods away from Bramwell, taking increasing responsibility for maintaining the garden alongside Agnes and beginning to show genuine promise in his own understanding of herbal remedies and their applications. When Eleanor returned to Bramwell after several weeks focused on establishing a training program in one of the southern provinces, she found him eagerly waiting to show her improvements he had made to the garden's layout, improvements that reflected genuine understanding rather than simple imitation of what he had observed her doing. "I moved the chamomile closer to the lavender," he explained proudly, leading her through the neatly organized rows of herbs. "Agnes said they grow better together because the chamomile helps keep certain pests away that might otherwise trouble the lavender." "That is excellent thinking," Eleanor said, genuine pride evident in her voice as she surveyed his work. "You have learned a great deal these past months, Freddie. I am proud of the dedication you have shown." It was during this same period that Eleanor received word of a health emergency in one of the northern provinces, where an outbreak of fever had begun spreading rapidly through several villages, overwhelming the limited resources of local physicians, unfamiliar with the specific combination of environmental factors contributing to the illness. Recognizing the urgency of the situation, Eleanor immediately began preparations to travel north, gathering supplies and reviewing her notes on similar outbreaks she had encountered in her earlier work. Nathaniel, learning of the emergency through his own connections within the royal court, insisted on accompanying her on this journey, citing both his familiarity with the northern provinces and genuine concern for her safety, given the potentially dangerous nature of the outbreak. "I have traveled those roads many times," he explained as they prepared for departure. "I know the local officials and can help facilitate whatever resources you might need to address this crisis effectively." The journey north proved challenging, with roads made difficult by recent rains, and news of the outbreak growing increasingly alarming as they traveled closer to the affected region. By the time they arrived at the primary village where the fever had first been reported, Eleanor found conditions considerably worse than initial reports had suggested, with dozens of villagers suffering from symptoms that local practitioners had struggled to properly treat. Working tirelessly alongside Nathaniel and local officials, Eleanor identified the source of the outbreak as contaminated water from a well that had been affected by recent flooding, mixing with waste from nearby livestock pens in ways that had introduced harmful bacteria into the primary water source for several villages. She immediately arranged for alternative water sources to be established while treating those already affected, with remedies drawn from her extensive knowledge of fever treatment. The following weeks proved among the most demanding of Eleanor's entire career, as she worked alongside local practitioners to treat the sick, while simultaneously training them in methods to identify and prevent similar outbreaks in the future. Nathaniel proved invaluable throughout this period, coordinating with local officials to ensure proper resources reached the affected villages, and providing steady support as Eleanor pushed herself to near exhaustion in her determination to save as many lives as possible. "You cannot save everyone by working yourself into collapse," Nathaniel told her one evening, finding her still reviewing patient notes long after most of the village had settled into sleep. "You will be of no use to anyone if you exhaust yourself entirely." "I know," Eleanor admitted, rubbing her tired eyes. "But every person I fail to save weighs heavily on my conscience, Nathaniel. I cannot simply rest while people continue to suffer." "Then let me help carry some of that weight," Nathaniel said gently, taking a seat beside her. "You need not face every challenge entirely alone." Something in his words, in the quiet sincerity with which he offered his support, touched Eleanor deeply. Over the months of their growing friendship, she had come to value Nathaniel's steady presence, his genuine admiration for her work, that never carried the possessive quality she had once experienced in her marriage, his willingness to support her ambitions, rather than simply expecting her to fulfill a predetermined role. By the time the outbreak had been successfully contained, with the vast majority of affected villagers recovering fully under Eleanor's careful treatment, word of her successful intervention had spread throughout the northern provinces, further cementing her growing reputation as a healer of remarkable skill and dedication. The king himself sent formal commendation for her efforts, along with additional resources to help establish permanent health infrastructure throughout the region to prevent similar outbreaks in the future. Upon their return to the capital, Eleanor found herself summoned once again before the king, this time to receive formal recognition for her successful handling of the northern outbreak. The ceremony proved considerably more elaborate than her initial presentation months earlier, with the king publicly praising her dedication and skill before the assembled court, formally granting her an independent noble title in recognition of her service to the kingdom, separate entirely from any connection to her previous marriage. Lady Eleanor Hartley, the king announced formally, in recognition of your exceptional service to this kingdom, I hereby grant you the title of Baroness, along with appropriate lands and resources to continue expanding your vital work throughout our provinces. Eleanor accepted this honor with genuine humility, understanding the profound significance of receiving noble title through her own merit rather than through marriage, an achievement she could scarcely have imagined during those dark early days at Bramwell, when she had arrived as nothing more than a disgraced, exiled wife. The transformation from that broken woman to the Baroness now standing before the king represented not merely a change in circumstances, but a fundamental redefinition of her own understanding of her worth and capabilities. Edward, present at this ceremony as he had been at her earlier presentation, watched with a complex mixture of pride and lingering regret as Eleanor received this formal recognition. He had continued, in the months since their private conversation regarding potential reconciliation, to demonstrate genuine remorse for his previous actions, supporting her work through appropriate resources from Ashworth Manor, and maintaining respectful distance while allowing her the space to determine her own path forward. Following the formal ceremony, as Eleanor mingled with nobles eager to congratulate her on this remarkable achievement, she found herself approached once again by Edward, his expression carrying the same complex mixture of hope and uncertainty that had characterized their previous conversations regarding their shared future. "Congratulations, Eleanor," he said sincerely. "This is a remarkable achievement, entirely deserved, given everything you have accomplished." "Thank you, Edward," Eleanor replied, genuine warmth in her voice, despite the complicated history between them. "I have given considerable thought to our previous conversation regarding the possibility of reconciliation." Edward's expression grew tense with anticipation as he waited for her to continue, uncertain what conclusion she might have reached regarding their future together. "I do not believe I can return to being your wife in the way I once was," Eleanor said carefully, watching disappointment briefly cross his features before she continued. "But I believe there might be room for a different kind of relationship between us, built on mutual respect, rather than the previous dynamic of our marriage. I would welcome your continued support of my work, and perhaps, in time, a friendship that acknowledges both the wrong that was done and the genuine effort you have shown to make amends." Edward considered her words carefully before responding, understanding that this offer, while not the full reconciliation he might have hoped for, represented a genuine opportunity to rebuild something meaningful from the wreckage of their previous relationship. "I would be honored to accept whatever relationship you believe possible between us, Eleanor. I have learned, through this entire difficult experience, that trust once broken cannot simply be restored through mere apology. It must be rebuilt slowly, through consistent action over time." As the celebration continued around them, Eleanor felt a genuine sense of peace settling over her, understanding that whatever the future held, she now approached it from a position of strength and self-determined purpose, rather than the vulnerability and dependence that had once characterized her relationship with the noble title and marriage that had defined her earlier life. The months that followed Eleanor's formal recognition as Baroness brought a period of steady growth and expansion to the work she had begun so many months earlier in the neglected gardens of Bramwell. With royal resources now fully behind her efforts, she established training centers in 3 additional provinces, each staffed by local practitioners she had personally trained in the practical methods combining herbal remedy with careful attention to environmental factors that so often contributed to persistent illness among struggling communities. Freddie had grown into a capable young assistant during this period, accompanying Eleanor on shorter journeys to nearby provinces and demonstrating increasing skill in identifying and preparing the remedies that formed the foundation of her practice. Eleanor had begun formally teaching him not just practical skills, but the deeper reasoning behind each treatment, recognizing in him a genuine aptitude for the work that reminded her strongly of her own early education under her mother's guidance. "Someday," she told him during one of their journeys together, watching him carefully prepare a tincture according to instructions she had given him, "you might continue this work yourself, perhaps even expanding it further than I have been able to accomplish alone." "I would like that very much," Freddie replied, his careful concentration on the task before him, not preventing the evident pride he felt at her confidence in his abilities. Nathaniel remained a steady presence throughout this period, his own duties as royal investigator, often bringing him to the same provinces where Eleanor established her training programs, allowing their friendship to continue deepening through shared dedication to improving conditions throughout the kingdom. What had begun as gratitude for her care during his illness had gradually transformed into something Eleanor found herself increasingly reluctant to examine too closely, aware of the genuine affection that had grown between them through their shared work and mutual respect. "You have accomplished remarkable things this past year," Nathaniel observed one evening, as they sat together reviewing reports from the various training centers she had established. "I confess I find myself in genuine admiration of everything you have built from such difficult circumstances." "I could not have accomplished nearly as much without your support," Eleanor replied honestly. "Your knowledge of the provinces, your connections within the court, they have made possible expansion I could never have managed working entirely alone." "Perhaps," Nathaniel said, his tone carrying a note of careful consideration, "we might continue building this work together, in whatever capacity you believe appropriate. I have found myself, these past months, increasingly reluctant to imagine a future that does not include your presence in some meaningful way." Eleanor felt her heart quicken at these words, recognizing in them an invitation she had perhaps unconsciously anticipated for some time. "I have found myself feeling similarly, Nathaniel, though I confess uncertainty about what such a future might look like, given the complicated nature of my previous marriage and the responsibilities I now carry." "We need not rush toward any particular conclusion," Nathaniel said gently. "I am content simply to continue building this important work alongside you, allowing whatever else might develop between us to unfold naturally, at whatever pace feels genuine, rather than forced." This conversation marked a subtle but significant shift in their relationship, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been quietly building throughout their shared work, without either of them fully articulating the depth of connection developing between them. Eleanor found herself approaching this new possibility with considerably more caution than she might have shown in her younger years, mindful of the pain she had experienced through her previous marriage, but also recognizing the fundamental difference in how Nathaniel treated her, as a genuine partner in meaningful work, rather than simply a wife expected to fulfill predetermined obligations. Meanwhile, Edward continued his own quiet process of rebuilding trust through consistent support of Eleanor's expanding work, providing resources from Ashworth Manor without expectation of anything in return, and maintaining the respectful distance she had requested, while their relationship gradually evolved into something resembling genuine friendship built on mutual respect, rather than the previous dynamic of marriage and obligation. He had, in the months following Clara's public disgrace, thrown himself into managing his estate with renewed dedication, determined to prove, through consistent action, the genuine remorse he felt for his previous hasty judgment. Lady Constance, Edward's mother, had also reached out to Eleanor during this period, expressing genuine regret for having believed the fabricated accusations that had led to her exile, and gradually building a warm relationship with the woman she had once been quick to condemn, without proper investigation. "I should have questioned Clara's account more carefully," she told Eleanor, during one visit to the capital. "I allowed my own health struggles to make me vulnerable to manipulation. I should have recognized more readily." "We all make mistakes when manipulated by those skilled in deception," Eleanor replied graciously, understanding that holding on to bitterness toward Lady Constance would serve no productive purpose, given the genuine remorse the older woman displayed. As autumn once again settled over the kingdom, bringing with it the golden colors that had marked Eleanor's first months at Bramwell nearly 2 years earlier. She found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had transformed her from a disgraced, exiled duchess into a baroness recognized throughout the kingdom for her genuine contributions to public health and welfare. The pain of that initial betrayal remained, an indelible part of her history that she would never fully forget, but it no longer defined her identity or limited her sense of what remained possible for her future. She had built something entirely her own, a network of trained practitioners spreading practical medical knowledge throughout provinces that had previously suffered from limited access to effective care, a garden and estate at Bramwell that continued to flourish under her careful stewardship, and relationships built on genuine mutual respect rather than obligation or expectation. Freddie had grown from a lonely orphan into a capable young man with genuine purpose and skill of his own. Nathaniel offered the possibility of a partnership built on shared values and mutual admiration, and even her relationship with Edward and his family had evolved into something considerably more honest and respectful than what had existed during her original marriage. As she stood in the gardens of Bramwell one crisp autumn evening, watching the last light of sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors over the estate that had become the foundation of her remarkable transformation, Eleanor felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. The disgrace and betrayal that had once threatened to destroy her had instead become the catalyst for discovering strength and purpose she had never known she possessed. Proof that even the most devastating circumstances could become the foundation for genuine growth and renewal, given sufficient resilience and determination to build something meaningful from whatever remained. 3 years had passed since Eleanor first arrived at Bramwell in Disgrace, and the transformation that had unfolded during that time now stood as a remarkable testament throughout the kingdom to what genuine dedication and resilience could accomplish. The training centers she had established now operated across nearly a dozen provinces, staffed by practitioners who had learned her methods and continued spreading practical, effective care to communities that had once suffered from persistent illness with little hope of proper treatment. The king, recognizing the profound impact of her sustained work, had recently appointed Eleanor to a permanent advisory position overseeing health policy throughout the entire kingdom, an unprecedented honor for a woman achieved entirely through demonstrated merit rather than noble birth or marriage. She now traveled regularly between the capital and the various provinces where her training centers operated, coordinating efforts to address emerging health challenges before they could develop into the kind of widespread crisis that had first brought her remarkable skills to royal attention. Freddie, now a young man of considerable skill and maturity, had taken over primary responsibility for the training center at Bramwell itself, having grown from the lonely orphan Eleanor had first encountered outside the village chapel into a respected practitioner in his own right. He had recently begun training his own students, passing forward the knowledge and dedication Eleanor had instilled in him during those formative years at Bramwell. "I could not have imagined this life for myself," Freddie told Eleanor during one of her visits to Bramwell, watching his own students carefully preparing remedies according to methods he now taught, with the same patient dedication Eleanor had once shown him. "You gave me not just a home, but genuine purpose. You earned that purpose through your own dedication and skill," Eleanor replied, genuine pride evident in her expression as she watched him work. "I simply provided the opportunity. What you built from it belongs entirely to you." Her relationship with Nathaniel had continued to deepen throughout these years, evolving naturally into a genuine partnership built on shared values and mutual respect for each other's work and ambitions. They had chosen, after careful consideration, to formalize their relationship through marriage 2 years after that first quiet conversation, acknowledging their growing feelings for one another. Though Eleanor had insisted on maintaining her independent title and continuing her important work, rather than simply becoming subsumed into her husband's identity, as had happened during her previous marriage. "This is a partnership between equals," she had told Nathaniel before their marriage, wanting to ensure complete clarity regarding her expectations for their shared future. "I will not simply become Lady Nathaniel, losing the identity and purpose I have built through my own efforts. Whatever we build together must honor both our individual contributions." Nathaniel had agreed wholeheartedly, understanding and genuinely respecting the hard-won independence Eleanor had achieved through her remarkable journey, an independence he had no desire to diminish through the traditional expectations that might have governed a more conventional marriage. Their relationship, built on this foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose, had grown into something considerably more genuine and satisfying than the marriage Eleanor had previously experienced, one where both partners contributed equally to their shared work and personal growth. Her relationship with Edward had also continued evolving into something considerably healthier than their original marriage, settling into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect for the different paths their lives had taken. Edward had eventually remarried, choosing a woman recommended by his mother who shared genuine compatibility with his temperament and values, and Eleanor found herself genuinely pleased to see him find happiness after the difficult lessons he had learned through his previous hasty judgment and its devastating consequences. Lady Constance had become something of a mentor figure to Eleanor's continued work, using her own social connections to help expand support for the training centers throughout various provinces, genuinely committed to making amends for the role she had inadvertently played in Eleanor's original exile, through her failure to question Clara's fabricated accusations more carefully. As for Clara Bennet, word occasionally reached the capital of her diminished circumstances, in a distant province, stripped entirely of the noble connections and privileges she had once enjoyed, though Eleanor found herself feeling no particular satisfaction in these reports, understanding that whatever consequences Clara faced mattered considerably less than the positive impact Eleanor had managed to build from the ashes of her own disgrace and betrayal. On a bright spring morning, nearly 4 years after her initial exile from Ashworth Manor, Eleanor stood once again in the gardens of Bramwell, now considerably expanded beyond what she had originally cultivated during those difficult early months of her disgrace. The herbs and flowers stretched in careful rows toward the morning sun, tended now by a new generation of students eager to learn the practical wisdom she had developed through years of dedicated study and patient experimentation. Nathaniel joined her in the garden, their young daughter Charlotte, named in honor of the childhood friend who had first helped confirm Eleanor's suspicions about Dr. Wren's corruption, toddling happily between the rows of flowers under the watchful eye of her father. Freddie's own students worked diligently nearby, learning skills that would eventually spread further still throughout the kingdom's provinces, carrying forward the legacy Eleanor had built from such difficult beginnings. "Do you ever think about how different your life might have been?" Nathaniel asked quietly, watching Eleanor survey the flourishing garden with evident satisfaction. "If Edward had never sent you away in disgrace?" Eleanor considered the question thoughtfully before responding. "I have thought about it many times over these years, but I have come to understand that dwelling on what might have been serves little purpose. What matters is what I chose to build from the circumstances actually given to me, however unjust and painful those circumstances initially seemed." She reached down to pluck a sprig of lavender, its fragrant scent carrying memories of that first difficult winter at Bramwell, when she had discovered Mistress Hartwell's old journals and begun the remarkable journey that had ultimately led her to this moment of genuine peace and accomplishment. "I was sent away in disgrace, believing myself destroyed by lies and betrayal, but I discovered instead that I possessed strength and purpose I had never known, strength that no marriage, no noble title, no husband's judgment could ever truly define or limit." Watching their daughter laugh with delight as she chased a butterfly through the garden rows, surrounded by the flourishing evidence of everything she had built through years of patient dedication and genuine skill, Eleanor felt profound gratitude for the remarkable path her life had taken. The Duchess, who had once been sent away in shame, had transformed herself into a baroness, recognized throughout the kingdom for her genuine contributions to public welfare, a woman whose worth had ultimately been determined not by marriage or noble birth, but by her own resilience, dedication, and the meaningful work she had chosen to build from even the most devastating circumstances life had presented to her. As the morning sun continued its steady climb over Bramwell's flourishing gardens, casting warm light over the estate that had become the foundation of her remarkable transformation, Eleanor Hartley understood with complete certainty that whatever challenges life might yet present, she now possessed the strength and wisdom to face them, having already proven to herself, and to an entire kingdom, that even the deepest disgrace could become the seed from which genuine triumph might ultimately grow.